Welcome to another philosophy video. In this video, I will explain my new argument from evil that I call the heaven ab initio creation problem of evil. The traditional problem of evil is based on the theistic God whose attributes are omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. Given such attributes, then the problem of evil is outlined as follows. Premise 1. If God exists, evil does not. But premise 2. Evil exists, therefore conclusion, God does not exist. Now, the traditional problem of evil says that God and evil cannot coexist. But the simplest answer is that how would you know? How would you know that God and evil cannot coexist? There are two examples. There are many examples, many theodicies and many defenses. But two examples are, one, preventing evil would require the abrogation of free will. That's a plausible answer. So the theologian can say, if you want to enjoy freedom of will, then you have to take the whole package. You are free, and you are free to be good. Then it's totally up to you if you want to use your freedom to do evil. But God cannot command or determine you to be good. Otherwise, you would be a puppet. Another plausible answer to the traditional problem of evil is that evil is actually useful because through evil and suffering, we acquire virtue. I mean, think about it. This is very plausible. When you fall off your bike, you hurt yourself. But then when you get up, you dust yourself off. And even if your knees are scratched up, you get back on the bike and you become resilient. You're a better person. You will have learned some sort of virtue. So these responses address the problem of evil, I think quite successfully, but they do not address the heaven ab initio creation. Heaven ab initio creation says the following. Premise 1. If God exists, he creates his children directly in heaven, but not directly on earth. Premise 2. God does not create his children directly in heaven, but not directly on earth. Therefore, it follows that God does not exist. Let me show you how it works. The question is, why, if God exists, God does not create his children on earth, but directly in heaven? Well, this is based on at least two concepts of theism. The first one is that God's goal is to create creatures that freely love him. God does not want to create the universe as an experiment or anything else. According to theism, for example, Christianity, God wants to create free-willed creatures in his image so that these creatures can know God and freely accept him. That's the final goal. So in other words, it is not part of the goal to create a world, a physical world, where human beings experience evil, unless it's absolutely necessary. The second concept is that God can create creatures directly in heaven. And he would do so if he could avoid evil and make sure that his creatures undergo a process of moral and intellectual evolution. So God can create free beings directly in heaven and avoid evil and enable soul building. So the first part is very easy. God can create free beings directly in heaven. I don't think that anyone would object to that. The second part is more contentious, and I have to explain why I think it's true that God can create creatures directly in heaven and avoid evil and enable soul building. So, can God avoid evil in heaven? Can God enable soul building in heaven and maintain freedom of will? I think the answer is yes. How do you avoid evil? In order to understand how God can avoid evil, you have to understand what evil is. When you think about it, evil is caused by passion, greed, power, etc. It is, in other words, caused by lust. But in heaven, there are no money, banks to rob. There's no murder. I mean, it's not like there are people who are living and you can kill a soul. And moreover, heaven is supposed to be a state of eternal bliss, where every single individual creature, God's child, is in a complete state of eternal bliss in the presence of God. Now, this is not something like being in an amusement park where, for example, Disney World, where the first hour or two you have fun, but then at the end of the day you get tired. We're talking about being in the presence of God, an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent being. So the intellectual effort undertaken by God's creatures is just eternal. So in other words, what I mean is that you will never be bored, and you will always be content and happy and intellectually satisfied, contemplating God's infinite nature. What else could a being want? In any case, the point is that when human beings, for example, on earth do evil, they do evil because, well, either they are deranged mentally, or they do it because they are not happy enough with what they have and who they are. Therefore, they start acquiring money, buying, spending, or stealing, or lying, etc., because they want to maximize their happiness. But in heaven, as I already pointed out, this is not even possible because there aren't cars. There's no reason. Okay, so the conditions for lusting, the conditions for doing evil are not present, and therefore, it's not possible to do evil. Now, with regard to freedom, obviously, these creatures can be free. Now, I don't really need to defend any arguments for this, because if theism is true, if it's true that when human beings die, they go to heaven, some of them go to heaven, and heaven is a state of eternal bliss where human souls exist for eternity in the presence of God, and they are free and evil is absent, then that's all I'm talking about. I'm not making up cooking up some argument. That's what it is. I'm just relying on the very theistic idea that heaven is possible, that exists, and it's a place where souls are free, and they never do evil, and they enjoy their existence. Now, the second one, soul building. Now, this idea of soul building is very strange, because it makes sense if you have physical beings, and so soul building applies to physical beings. For example, suppose that you notice that there's a building or a house on fire, and you know that there are children in that house. You're not a very courageous person, but for some reason, this prompts you to just run into the house and save the children, in spite of fear. Now, after this experience, suppose that you survive and the children survive. It's certainly edifying, and it's certainly an experience that gives you courage and maybe other such virtues. So it is very useful. The problem is that once you go to heaven, you don't need those virtues, because why should you need courage? Well, courage is a virtue that is useful when a person faces a dangerous situation. But when you go to heaven, there are no dangerous situations. So what do you need courage for? You don't really need it. Furthermore, it is possible for heavenly creatures to develop virtues. Now, the virtues that these creatures will develop are going to be appropriate, are going to be apt to the kind of creatures that they are. So, in other words, what I want to say is that it is possible for heavenly creatures to acquire virtues, just like it is possible for physical creatures like us to acquire virtues. The problem is that we should not confuse the type of creatures that we are. So there are appropriate virtues for physical beings, and there are appropriate virtues for heavenly creatures. Okay? So it is perfectly possible for these creatures to acquire virtues. Let me consider some objections. Objection 1. Immaterial beings or spiritual beings can do evil. Think about Lucifer. Think about angels, demons. Well, the simple answer is that the kind of world that I imagine, the heaven ab initio argument from evil, is not a world that includes angels and special creatures. Why did God create angels? No idea. The point is, God does not have to create angels. God can create his children without special powers like angels, where God loves them all unconditionally and gives them undivided attention, and each individual can love God and love each other, but it doesn't have to cause any evil and suffering. Objection 2. The theist can say, I am not convinced that if God creates his children directly in heaven, these creatures will never sin. Now, my answer is the following. First point is what could these creatures possibly do that causes evil and suffering? Ask yourself, can these creatures steal? Well, there's nothing to steal. There are no personal properties, presumably, in heaven. There's no money or cars or houses or rings or necklaces. Can they kill? Well, no, they cannot kill. Can they abuse others? Well, not really. And even if they could, what would be the reason for abusing others? You already have everything that you need in heaven. Could they go on strike? Could they fold their arms and say, I don't want to comply with God's orders? Well, the point is that God, first of all, can create only the subset of creatures that would freely obey him. But also God can simply discipline the naughty ones. God can discipline them, can teach them, hence allowing for moral growth. But in the end, even if some of the creatures do not comply with God's plan and order, this scenario is still better than the physical world where human beings experience horrendous evil, and we make no sense of it. The last objection is very interesting. The last objection says that the choices that we make, human beings, despite physical suffering, are morally greater than the choices that creatures created ab initio in heaven make, because they don't involve any suffering. Now, my answer is the following. Why is it that the choices that we make are morally greater than any other creature's choices? It seems just arbitrary to say so. The second point is, think of the life of a slave whose wife and daughter are raped by the master, and then the slave is burned alive. Now suppose that the slave goes to heaven. Okay? Now, how could you possibly say that such a life and event that the slave had to experience, to go through, is morally significant? But significant to whom? Think about the slave, his family, his friends, and his fellow heaveners, who will forever remember such event and life. How could they possibly be happy in heaven? Even if heaven is free of evil, how could they possibly enjoy heaven thinking that, just think about the slave, thinking that he was burned at the stake, abused, that his daughter and his wife were raped by the slave master. I think it's absurd. Now, furthermore, think about it. What if for some reason the slave's wife and daughter, instead of going to heaven, they go to hell? They are separated from the slave. How could you possibly think that the slave, after all he went through in his life, now he can enjoy heaven? He can say, yes, I understand this. I'm finally rewarded by heaven, thinking that he's not there with his wife and daughter. It's terrible. So I don't think that heaven is a solution according to, if we look at heaven from the perspective of Christianity or theism in general. So my conclusion is that God allegedly created us to know and love him. If this is true, then God ought to create ab initio in heaven. But creation ab initio avoids natural and moral evil and allows God's creatures to be free and to have appropriate virtues and freedom. But because this is not the case, it follows that God does not exist. This is it. That's all. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me, email me, drop a comment, and I'll be more than glad to discuss this. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.